Evening, everyone, and welcome to our Hub Talk on Christian and Muslim perspectives on loving thy neighbor with Dr. Craig Constantine and Charles Upton. Many thanks to Basma Idris and Aswad Ensemble for performing, to our speakers, Craig and Charles, to everyone at Hub Foundation and Hub 925 for making this event possible, including our founder, Sam Hirbod. I'd also like to thank all of you, our guests, for supporting this event. Tonight, we're doing something unique. Christians, Muslims, and others are too often forced to defend themselves. But tonight, Dr. Craig Constantine, a Catholic academic, will discuss the plight of Muslims in the U.S. And Charles Upton, a Muslim scholar, will focus on the plight of Christians and others in the Middle East. I believe we will discover that love thy neighbor must be more than a slogan or a nicety. That real love requires standing up for vulnerable and persecuted individuals and communities. Both Christians and Muslims are too often painted with broad brushstrokes as intolerant extremists because of the actions of governments and groups that claim to represent these faiths. Yet both groups, as well as people from other traditions, are often targeted because of their faith. We mustn't allow others to define and divide us. I am pleased to host two eminent scholars who are taking practical steps to speak out for and defend their neighbors from other faiths. We'll start with Dr. Constantine, who tonight is speaking on Muslims in America. Dr. Craig Constantine is a U.S. Catholic of Irish and Italian descent from Massachusetts. He is based at the Department of Sociology at Rice University. Dr. Constantine holds a PhD from Trinity College Dublin, a master's degree from the University of London, and a bachelor's from American University. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Muslims in America, Examining the Facts, and A Catholic's Love of Islam. Dr. Constantine is an educator, activist, and proponent of religious pluralism, as well as stronger Christian-Muslim relations. Dr. Constantine's new book, Muslims in America, is among the most informed and accessible studies on the subject. I consider it the best book to dispel stereotypes since John Esposito's What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. Craig is an heir to great Christian scholars such as Louis Massignon and Thomas Merton, who offer a more sympathetic assessment of Islam and a more loving embrace of Muslims. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Craig Constantine.
Good evening, everyone. Peace be with you all. Assalamu alaikum. I'm going to give a little gratitude before I get into my talk. I'd first like to thank Sam Hirbod and the Hub 925 for making this possible. Beautiful, unique space, one that I've actually never seen. Zachary gave Miriam and I a tour, so it's a beautiful spot. Zachary, I'd like to thank you as well for helping coordinate this event. The Hub Foundation, of course, for standing for these three words that you see in front of you, three words that I think I try to live my life by on a daily basis, at least I hope to. And of course, Basma Idris and Aswat Ensemble for putting me in a trance before I got up on stage. That was really beautiful, so thank you for that. So I have 30 minutes, and I have this talk broken down into kind of 5 parts. I'm going to start with kind of providing a frame of thinking, let's call it a theory in academic terms. I then want to shift slightly to some facts that are coming out of the book that Zachary had mentioned. These facts pertain not only to anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia, but also towards the experiences of American Muslims and how Americans get their information about Muslims. From there, I want to shift slightly to Christian identity and what it means to be a Christian in contemporary America, because my perspective in tonight's event is to speak from a Catholic perspective. I'm going to then shift slightly to the contemporary inspirations that I think we can all look up to, and we can leave here with a call to action, which I will end with. So here we go. I'm going to start with a quote from a Swiss-American psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I see some hands. She's the author of the groundbreaking book called On Death and Dying. It was published in 1969. It's still quite influential in a lot of fields. So she introduced her theory of grief, 5 stages of grief, with which I think a lot of people in here might be familiar with. But there's a quote from this book, On Death and Dying, that I think is really important to a talk on loving thy neighbor. So here's the quote. She says, "There are only 2 emotions, love and fear. All positive emotions come from love, all negative emotions from fear. From love flows happiness, contentment, peace, and joy. From fear comes anger, hate, anxiety, and guilt." Kubler-Ross continues. She says, "It's true that there are only 2 primary emotions, love and fear. But it's more accurate to say that there is only love or fear. For we cannot feel these 2 emotions together at exactly the same time. They are opposites. If we're in fear, we are not in a place of love. When we're in a place of love, we cannot be in a place of fear." So what she is suggesting here, Kubler-Ross, is that I think ultimately we have a choice. Do we love or do we live in fear? Interestingly enough, about 10 years ago, I was at MIT in Boston, where I was born and raised. I'm from Needham, Massachusetts, as Zach said, of Irish and Italian descent. I had the honor of sitting in Noam Chomsky's office, the famed linguist and philosopher and dissenter of a lot of domestic and foreign policies that the United States engages in. And I was doing a study on Muslims in America, and we asked him a question: what does it mean to be American? And he said just 2 words: myth, which goes to, Plymouth Rock and all of these kind of historic ideas, but then he said fear. And he said fear is the one common thread that runs throughout American history. He says we are a very frightened country, and we live in a time today where I think one of the boogeymen or boogie people happen to be Muslims. But if you go back into American history, we know Native Americans, Irish Catholics, Jews, Italians, Mexicans, and so on and so forth. So we're living in a time in which Muslims happen to be one of the targets. So what is the fear that is running behind Islamophobia? But I think I'll get into that in a little bit, but I think we also need to think about what is fear? What is that term? And when I was preparing for this talk, I came across a Indian yogi and a seeker and a mystic. His name is Yogi Yasudev. I was actually unfamiliar to his work prior to watching this YouTube video. And he said a couple things that I think really do capture fear. And as I'm talking about this, keep in mind the context of Muslims in America and also Christians. He says that fear is, first, when you define it, you have to define what it is not. So it is not nurturing, it is not relaxing, it is not reassuring. Perhaps fear is wanting control, that these negative emotions come out because you feel like you've lost control of something. Perhaps fear is living too much in your own mind. Perhaps it's living in isolation. Perhaps fear is something like putting boundaries around yourself and not wanting to leave those boundaries. Perhaps fear is just wanting protection. And he continues, perhaps fear is about the present, not about the present, but rather what might happen. So he essentially ends by saying fear is the non-existent. So fear is what you might think of something happening. So when we think about, in the context of Muslims in America, Sharia law. Some of you may not be familiar with Sharia law. In essence, it's Islamic law, defined literally as the way to the watering well. For Christians, it's like a Ten Commandment. It's a way of life. And what we see in this country, a lot of the fear around Sharia is actually, it's myth, it's propaganda. It's a non-existent threat, this idea that less than 1% of the United States wants to overthrow the United States Constitution and implement some law that is going to dictate everyone's lives, even though most Muslims in this country don't actually see Sharia law that way. They actually prefer to be governed by national laws, constitutional laws. So that's kind of love and fear. Like that's kind of, I'm going to bring you on a little guide, a little journey on what these two terms mean in the context of my own experiences, but also Muslims in America. So for Christians, and for the Christians in the room, you might be familiar with Pope John Paul. He was before Pope Benedict and before Pope Francis. And in his first homily as Pope, he said with an exclamation point, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid." He is encouraging Christians to be courageous, because when you have courage, you don't have room for fear. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the overcoming of fear. So how do we actually overcome this fear that we're seeing in the context of Muslims, but also more broadly, what we're seeing happening to Muslims and this fear around them? It's also happening to multiple other minority populations in this country. So don't be afraid. He said that over 30 years ago. It remains useful advice, especially for Christians. Because if you're actually a Christian, right, you must believe that you are safer in God's hands than your own. And we should take care, and I'm speaking to Christians now, we should take care of the future and preach compassion and love for all without distinction, because once Christians do that, people will know Christians for their love and not for the fear that a lot of people see Christians having. Fear and Islamophobia, by Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, inextricably linked. You cannot separate those two things from happening or from occurring at the same time. The tide of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim sentiment, has swept over the entire country. And there's an ongoing list of shameful Islamophobic acts that have happened in recent years. And sorry to bring us down, but I think it's important to recognize the severity of the issue before we can find solutions. Muslims in this country have been shot and killed execution style in their homes. They have been beaten in their stores, their schools, and on the streets. Mosques have been torched to the ground. Mosque doors have been covered in feces, and torn pages of the Quran have been found at the doors of mosques. Muslims have been fired for wearing hijabs and for praying. Politicians in this country have claimed that 85% of mosques are controlled by so-called Islamic extremists, and that Islam is a political system, not a religion, and thus not protected by the cherished First Amendment. So why do these acts happen? Why do people, or how do people come to certain views that lead them to going into a mosque, taking some gasoline and a blowtorch and deciding to torch it? How do people come to that conclusion or to that act? Of course, it has to do with fear, but we're not born fearful, I don't think. We're programmed to be afraid of things. So how are we programmed to get to a point where we hold, or some people might hold, anti-Muslim views? So I'm going to read some statistics, I think, for those quantitative nerds in here. I think you'll appreciate these. And these are documented in some of the research that I've been carrying out. So there was a Public Religion Research Institute survey carried out in 2015, which found that more than 6 in 10 Americans have seldom or never had a conversation with a Muslim. So more than 6 in 10 have never had a conversation with the Muslim. Furthermore, 83% of Americans say they know little or nothing about Islam. 83% of Americans say they know little or nothing about Islam. The lack of exposure to American Muslims and its connection to Islamophobia is also highlighted by the Pew Research Center. In 2014, a Pew poll revealed that 38% of Americans know a Muslim, which means that 72% don't, so similar findings. Huffington Post and YouGov, they carried out a poll in 2015. Again, similar findings. 55% of Americans had either a somewhat or unfavorable view of Islam, while 25% said they were not sure how they viewed the faith. So, big picture, not good. Not good at all. So how do people come to this conclusion? Christopher Bale, a sociologist at North Carolina, he is arguing that the media is a big contributor to why people hold these views. So he did a study. He collected 1,084 press releases from 120 organizations, which included Muslim and Christian groups, evangelical groups, and he found that the press releases that were more emotional, that focused on violence, that were more sensationalized, tended to be the press releases that actually got published into media sources. LexisNexis Academic and CNN also did a joint study from 2011 and 2015, and it found that U.S. news media gave drastically more coverage to attacks by Muslims, particularly foreign-born Muslims, Muslim migrants, than by non-Muslim offenders. So when you do that, obviously you start, a lot of Americans might start thinking, okay, violence is equated with Islam, which is equated with Muslims. When you see the term terrorism, also the same pattern of thought, Muslims, terrorism, that's the enemy. The study also found that, on average, Muslim perpetrators of violence had 449% more coverage in the media than attacks carried out by non-Muslims. 449%, which is massive. Zachary earlier had mentioned John Esposito, a scholar at Georgetown University. He also carried out a study, and this is focusing on media. From 2001 to 2011, he analyzed a bunch of different media outlets, and in 2001, 2% of all news stories in the Western media focused on Muslim militants, let's call them, while just over 0.1 presented stories of ordinary Muslims, the mainstream majority, let's call them that. By 2011, the 2% of stories had risen to 25% of Muslim militant images, fanaticism, terrorism, and violence, while the coverage of ordinary mainstream Muslims remained at 0.1%. So if you can kind of follow where I'm going here, fear and anti-Muslim sentiment, it's organized. We're taught to think certain ways. In a way, it's a form of brainwashing. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that term, of brainwashing and propaganda. We get information from somewhere. But if the media outlets are only presenting a certain image of a certain group of people, and if you're only presenting terrorism as this or that, inevitably the people are going to be fearful. So Islamophobia is learned. And there's also another study, a great book if you want to go home and check this out. It's called Real Bad Arabs, in 2004, written by Professor Jack Shaheen, who great scholar who has recently passed on. But he analyzed the entertainment industry, films, Hollywood films. Over 1,200 films he actually analyzed. He found that 932 out of the 1,200 depicted Muslims in a negative light, which is kind of this brown, bearded, violent, misogynistic, terroristic portrayal. Islamophobia is learned. Fear is learned, essentially. So how do Christians grapple with this reality, with this development? I would suggest that we have to start reimagining what it means to be a Christian. when Christians in this country have reached a point where they think that hating Muslims is a matter of common sense or a matter of theological or religious principle, I think it's safe to say that American Christians in this country are not simply at a crossroads, but at a crisis point. The percentage of evangelicals, and I'm going to provide some facts here, the percentage of evangelicals in this country in 2015 who said that religious freedom in the U.S. has declined over the past decade rose from 60% in 2012 to 77% in 2015. So just 3 years ago, 77% of evangelical Christians feel like they are being discriminated against in this country. Again, fear. The defensiveness that U.S. Christians, evangelicals are feeling in this country, another stat in 2012, 54% of white evangelicals supported giving preference to traditional Judeo-Christian values. That number rose to 76% in 2015. Now note this term, Judeo-Christian values, coming out of the 1970s, before Reagan came into power, this idea that America is somehow linked to stories that were written a long, long time ago in the Middle East. Islam is always left out of that term, Judeo-Christian, even though Jews, Christians, and Muslims arguably, I think, trace their roots back to Abraham. So what do we do about that? Some of you may be evangelicals, maybe not. If you aren't, maybe you can have a conversation with some evangelicals over the next couple weeks. So what do we do? I think Christians, and not simply evangelicals, we have to start confronting real-life circumstances rather than simply through theology or religious principles. We have to start thinking about other realities. Let's call that humanity. Interestingly, evangelical Christians, again, and I don't mean to be singling them out, but the data actually shows that this is the population that has the most anti-Muslim views. White evangelical Christians like guns, but they don't particularly like migrants or refugees, especially compared to other demographics. They are in favor of the death penalty, but they're indifferent to the impoverished, and I think blind to racial and gender inequalities. But I think while those realities exist, the issue, the hatred, the fear, it's deeper. Christians claim to read the Bible and hear the teachings of Jesus, but simply because you hear does not mean you can understand. There's a difference there. Many Christians in this country think that Muslims are condemned to eternal hell and that poor people get what they deserved, or Muslims who are violently attacked on the street actually get what they deserve. Christians today in this country, and I'm broadly speaking here, I think they seem to be governed by fear and not love. Governed by fear, not love. Fear is what is driving, I think, a lot of the social and political issues that we see happening around us today. For believers in a religion whose scripture teaches compassion, many Christians in this country appear to be breathtakingly cruel. So let me be more optimistic now. Let me talk about love. I'm sure some of you saw the wedding, the royal wedding that happened maybe a month ago. There's a man named Bishop Michael Curry. He is an Episcopalian bishop, and he gave a message on the redemptive power of love, the redemptive power of love. And he turned to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he quoted Dr. Martin Luther King, and I'll read that quote. King Jr. said, "We must discover the power of love, the redemptive power of love. And when we do that, we will make of this world, old world, a new world, for love is the only way." Bishop Curry added, and you have to watch this YouTube video. I literally watched it 3 times. I think I cried every time. He said that there's power in love. There's power in love, and don't underestimate it. Don't even over-sentimentalize it. There's power in love. He goes on to say, there is something right about love as well. And there's a reason for that feeling. The reason has to do with the source. We were made by our Creator by a power of love. And our lives were meant and are meant to be lived in that love. That's why we are here. So what he's saying, I think, is that love heals. Love can transform us. Love can call us into action. When I think about this too, I also think of the old Jewish saying, tikkun olam, to heal a fractured world. To heal a fractured world. And we can do that with love. So in terms of reimagining ourselves as Christians, some of us in here may be quite tight, let me say that, with how you view Jesus. Rather than viewing him through the lens of divinity or theology, why don't we simply put those matters aside, whether he's the Son of God or not, and just view him as a revolutionary that stood for social justice. He sparked a movement grounded in the unconditional love of God and the world, from the water to the soil to the trees to the neighbors to ourselves. Unconditional love. His revolution called on people to live that love. Meaningful change, meaningful action, that you have to live that love. And when you do that, you not only change your own life, but you can change the world. Jesus' love actually carried him into contact with the alienated people so that they might experience not only love, but healing. And we can turn to the story of the Good Samaritan, which I think is treated as such a simple Christian tale that everyone knows. It's a parable. Everyone knows it. Non-Christians know it. But we don't live it. When Jesus was asked by a lawyer, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus responded with the following. He said, this is a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and the man fell down among robbers, who both stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. By chance, a certain priest was going down that road. When the priest saw him, he passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite also, when he came to that place and saw the man down, passed by on the other side, just walked by. But a certain Samaritan, as he traveled, came where that man was. When he saw him, he was moved with compassion. He came to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He set him on his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, which is money, and he gave them to the host. And he said to the host, "Take care of this man. Whatever you spend beyond that, I will repay you when I return." Now, which of these 3, he said to the lawyer, do you think seemed to be a neighbor to him who fell among the robbers? That's the question. The lawyer said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." That's from Luke chapter 10, verses 30 through 37. Now, why don't Christians, when a mosque is torched, why don't they go to that mosque and be neighborly? Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question. But note, too, in the story of the Samaritan, Jesus did not limit his compassion and his love for his own nationality, his own race, or his own religion. The Samaritans at the time, the Jews, the Hebrew Jews, tended to look down upon Samaritans. They were kind of this isolated, strange people living off in the distance. So Jesus specifically chose the Samaritan to show that the Samaritan can do good and does do good. When I was in Columbia, Tennessee, this was in 2008, I was spending time with a very, very small Muslim community that just had their mosque torched by a member of the Christian identity movement. It's a white supremacy movement. and the local bishop of a church gave the keys to his church to the local Muslim community. Where I'm from, or where I live at the moment, in Houston, Texas, the Victoria Islamic Center was also torched to the ground right after Donald Trump took his inauguration. A local Jewish community went to the mosque leader and gave him the keys to the synagogue and said, here you go. Unconditional love. Doesn't matter. Jesus was moved by love, not fear. To Jesus, to love the neighbor as you love yourself was to practice justice towards other humans. And we have so many passages in the New Testament that talk about love, that we need to lift up these verses. Christians, Muslims, non-Christians, non-Muslims, everyone needs to lift these up. Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Some of you may know this. This was read at my sister's wedding. I actually read this, and this is a very powerful quote. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects the truth, always trusts, and always hopes, and it always perseveres. Pope Francis is a leader that I think is doing his best to uplift that vision, not only of Jesus and Christianity, but of humanity. In 2017, in April of 2017, he was in Cairo, Egypt, at a peace conference. And he pulled absolutely no punches when he said he called on Christians and Muslims to join in building a new civilization fueled by love and by pluralism. In early 2014, Pope Francis called on human beings to end the culture of indifference. End the culture of indifference. Why don't we care? And I'm not saying that to Christians and simply Muslims, humans. Why aren't people moved by what's happening on the southern border? By children being ripped away from parents? Like, how do we actually get people to start caring about that, to end that culture of indifference? Pope Francis has a recommendation. He suggests that we start engaging in the culture of encounter. The culture of encounter. Another way of kind of understanding this, I call it Deuce. Deuce is an acronym, D-E-U-C-E, and it stands for the following. The D is dialogue. We have to start talking with one another at a very, very basic level. And the best way to do that, break bread, have food with people. Once you have that dialogue, then you can really start educating one another. You can bring out the books, you can talk about the news, and you can sit down and you can start dispelling myths. Once you properly educate, then we can get to that U, which is understanding. That's when the light bulb can go off, and we can really start making progress. When we educate and we understand, then we can join and we can commit. The C stands for commitment. That's when we can hold the same principles, we can hold the same vision. And when we do that, the E is engagement. That's when we can go out into the world and work together. That is the culture of encounter. So to end this, my 30 minutes is up. I'll take about one more minute. So love. You know, I think we tend to just think about it as a personal experience. You love your father, you love your mother, you love your partner. What Jesus was saying and what all the sages were saying, from Prophet Muhammad to Moses and on down the line, love is more than that. Love is a law of life. It's a law of life, that we are human beings coming from a single creator, and we're coming from creation. Love, when we reach that point, and when we engage in that, and when we live love, we can really get to a higher state of consciousness that frees us from fear, frees us from negative thoughts, negative feelings, and negative actions. When you love and when you transcend fear, gone are all these negative things in our life. Fear, guilt, judgment, greed, envy, arrogance, and the ego's stubborn need to be right. When we live love, not just talk about love, when we live love, we know that we're actually all connected, that we're not divided amongst races and religions, that we are a human family, a human body, and that it's each and every one of our responsibilities to become one with humanity. There's no separation when we love. We are all children of the living Creator, and what affects one affects us all. E pluribus unum, out of many one. That is one of the mottos of the United States, and I think we need to think deeply about what that actually means. So let me leave with a call to action. Hopefully we can all pledge today, right now, that living love should be our intention 24/7, 365. Living love should be the agenda of every interaction. It should be the prescription for every ill. And really, it should be the expectation of every single circumstance. Live love. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Constantine, for that stirring talk. I, for one, could feel your sincerity and really honor your voice standing up for Muslims in this time. And I'm also reminded just briefly of two verses from the Quran which speak of fear. The first says, whoever believes in this message, i.e. Muslims, or the Jews, Christians, Sabians, whoever believes in the one God and works righteousness, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. And the other refers to the friends of God, or the saints, and it also says about them, no fear shall come upon them, neither shall they grieve. To our second speaker tonight, Charles Upton, who will be speaking about Christians and others in the Middle East. Charles Upton is an American Muslim sage based in Lexington, Kentucky. He has written works on metaphysics, poetry, social criticism, and the path of Islamic Sufism. Some of his major titles include The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age, Folk Metaphysics, The Virtues of the Prophet, and Day and Night on the Sufi Path. With Dr. John Andrew Morrow, Upton conceived of the Covenants Initiative, which is a declaration signed by Muslims around the world calling for the protection of Christians and all human beings, including Muslims themselves, from ISIS and similar groups. Charles was raised in Marin County, where he lived for 56 years. He's a veteran of the 60s counterculture, a San Francisco poet, with a background as a peace activist in response to the U.S. war in Vietnam and military support in El Salvador. In 1988, he was initiated into Sufism. In 2004, he left California for Kentucky with his wife, Jenny. And again, in 2013, he encountered the work, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with Christians of the World, and co-founded the Covenants Initiative. Allow me to add that I consider Charles among our great American elders and sages. He is perhaps the leading representative of the traditionalist or perennialist school, while also at times being a friendly critic, and an heir to the French metaphysician René Guénon or Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya. Please join me in welcoming Charles Upton.
Well, I'd like to thank Zachary Markwith for his gracious invitation to me to come here and his, his help and his support of us in our travel. And, he took care of everything and made it easy for us, for my wife and I. And also, of course, Sam Herbad, who's, has quite a conception going here on many levels. I'm very impressed. So I'm going to read my speech to make sure I don't go on and on and on. And but before I do, I want to say two things. First, my wife Jenny is a Christian, and we figured if a Muslim like me and a Christian like her could get along, then anything is possible. And as she said just today, religion isn't something that divides us, because we both realize that God is one. There's one God, different nations, different religions use different names for him. The Antiochian Christians of Syria use the name Allah in their divine liturgy when they're, which is their version of the Mass. So different names. As William Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And that's what he meant. Secondly, I'm going to end this with a few quatrains from Jalaluddin Rumi, and I just want to say that I really wanted to see if Rumi could be turned into song lyrics. In other words, regular meter that turned into iambic pentameter, and so I just wanted to say that first. That this will touch upon, love between neighbors, love of Muslims for Christians in the Mideast. But that's the midpoint. It starts from God, and it goes through these situations, very rigorous, difficult situations that we're facing in the world now, and then it returns to God. And that's what everything actually does. That's the circle. So this, I'm calling this Muslim Perspectives on Loving Thy Neighbor. The theme of my talk is love of neighbor in the context of Islam, in the context of religion, that is, not in that of clinical social work or secular social justice. In other words, as Jesus of Nazareth, peace and blessings be upon him, made clear in his commandments, when it comes to love, God comes first. In one way, it is true that we can't love God unless we have first learned to love our neighbor. But in another and more primary way, we can only love anyone or anything at all because God has loved us first. All true love is from Allah, returns to Allah, and is the actual presence of Allah. This love is not always easy. It carries the qualities of mercy and beauty, but also the qualities of majesty and rigor. As the Irish poet W.B. Yeats said, love is like the lion's tooth. The rigor of beauty is perfectly expressed by the Muslim poet of Andalusia, Ibn al-Qabturnu, in the following 6 lines. I remembered Sulaima when the passion of battle was as fierce as the passion of my body when we parted. I thought I saw among the lances the tall perfection of her body, and when they bent toward me, I embraced them. The French poet Paul Révédy said something I've never forgotten. There is no such thing as love, only proofs of love. In the interfaith world, there are plenty of protestations of love between the faiths, diplomatic gestures, smiles, bows, hand clasps, embraces, photo opportunities. But where is the proof? The wedding ceremony may be beautiful and moving, but the proof of the marriage does not lie in what nowadays is often called a piece of paper. It lies in the reality of, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Yet an essential part of love is respect, and an important part of respect is distance. As the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, love consists in this, that two solitudes protect, border, and salute each other. Our several ways to God, like our marriages to our spouses, are unique, intimate, sacred, and not to be adulterated by any foreign elements. The proof of the love of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, for his brother prophet Jesus of Nazareth and the religion he founded, is enshrined in the prophetic covenants, treaties concluded by the Prophet Muhammad with the various Christian communities of his time. And these covenants themselves would have been mere pieces of paper, except for Muhammad's declaration that they came to him by Allah's inspiration, his command that all Muslims abide by them until the coming of the hour, the end of the world, and his warning that all who violate them will earn Allah's curse. Here is the English translation of the text of the first covenant granted by Muhammad to the ancient monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. This covenant was written by Muhammad, the son of Abdallah, and the proclaimer and warner trusted to protect Allah's creations in order that people may raise no claim against Allah after the event of his messengers, for Allah is almighty, wise. He has written it for the members of his religion and to all those who profess the Christian religion in East and West, near or far, Arabs or non-Arabs, known or unknown, as a covenant of protection. If anyone breaks the covenant herein proclaimed or contravenes or transgresses its commands, he has broken the covenant of Allah, breaks his bond, makes a mockery of his religion, deserves the curse of Allah, whether he is a sultan or another among the believing Muslims. If a monk or pilgrim seeks protection in mountain or valley, in a cave, or in tilled fields, in the plain, in the desert, or in a church, I am behind them, defending them from every enemy. I, my helpers, all the members of my religion, and all my followers, for they, the monks and the pilgrims, are my protégés and my subjects. I protect them from interference with their supplies and from payment of taxes, save what they willingly renounce. There shall be no compulsion or constraint against them in any of these matters. A bishop shall not be removed from his bishopric, nor a monk from his monastery, nor a hermit from his tower, nor shall a pilgrim be hindered in his pilgrimage. Moreover, no building from among their churches shall be destroyed, nor shall the money from their churches be used for the building of mosques or houses for the Muslims. Whoever does such a thing violates Allah's covenant and dissents from the messenger of Allah. Neither poll tax nor fees shall be laid on monks, bishops, or worshipers. He's not referring to all Christians, but, monks and hierarchs and, those, who are attached to monasteries, at least. Wherever they be, on land or sea, in east and west, in north and south, they are under my protection, within my covenant, and under my security, against all harm. Those who also isolate themselves in the mountains or in sacred sites shall be free from the poll tax, land tribute, and from tithe or duty on whatever they grow for their own use, and they shall be assisted in raising a crop by a free allowance of 1 qada, unit of dry measure, in every ardab, equals 6 waiba, equals 24 rub'ah, other measures, for their personal use. They shall not be obliged to serve in war or to pay the poll tax. Even those for whom an obligation to pay land tribute exists, or who possess resources in land or from commercial activity, shall not have to pay more than 12 dirhams a head per year. On no one shall an unjust tax be imposed, and with the people of the book there is to be no strife, unless it be over what is good. It's a reference to a Quranic verse. We wish to take them under the wing of our mercy, and the penalty of vexation shall be kept at a distance from them, wherever they are and wherever they may settle. If a Christian woman enters a Muslim household, she shall be received with kindness, and she shall be given opportunity to pray in her church. There shall be no dispute between her and a man who loves her religion. Whoever contravenes the covenant of Allah and acts to the contrary is a rebel against his covenant and his messenger. These people should be assisted in the maintenance of the religious buildings and their dwellings. They will be aided in their faith, and thus they will be aided in their faith and kept true to their allegiance. None of them shall be compelled to bear arms, but the Muslims shall defend them, and they shall never contravene this promise of protection until the hour comes and the world ends. As witness to this covenant, which was written by Muhammad, son of Abdullah, the messenger of Allah, may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, to all the Christians. As sureties for the fulfillment of all that is prescribed herein, the following persons set their hands. Okay, the signatures of the witnesses to this covenant include those of 4 future caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, along with those of many of the Prophet's companions. Muhammad issued similar covenants to many Christian communities in Arabia, Iraq, Syria, and Armenia, as well as making covenants with the Jews, the Zoroastrians, and the Sabaeans. All these documents have similar provisions along with special features relevant to specific communities. Before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans at the end of World War I, the prophetic covenants were known to most literate Muslims and virtually all scholars in the Muslim world, as well as many Western scholars. They were attested to by Muslim historians and in many cases renewed annually or semi-annually by caliphs and sultans. They formed the basis for official Ottoman policy toward religious minorities. When the Ottoman Empire fell, however, the covenants began their descent into obscurity since they were seen as little more than the irrelevant documents of a defunct bureaucracy. Then, in 2013, 5 years ago, the memory of the prophetic covenants was resurrected in an epoch-making book by Dr. John Andrew Morrow entitled The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World, which I was privileged to co-edit and to which I contributed a foreword. By next summer, pretty quick, Dr. Morrow, Ilyas Abd al-Alim Islam, a Native American from Quebec who converted from Catholicism to Islam in his teens, was denouncing ISIS before the House of Lords in London as part of his European tour to spread word of the covenants. And that was only the beginning. It's been quite a ride. As part of my foreword, I composed a declaration addressed to Christians, inviting Muslims to declare themselves legally bound by the covenants of the Prophet. This declaration formed the basis of what was to become an international peace movement known as the Covenants Initiative. It was signed by many prominent Muslim scholars, along with Muslims from all walks of life in many parts of the world. The declaration reads, "We, the undersigned, hold ourselves bound by the spirit and the letter of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, with the Christians of the world, in the understanding that these covenants, if accepted as genuine, have the force of law in the Sharia today, and nothing in the Sharia, as traditionally and correctly interpreted, has ever contradicted them. As fellow victims of the terror and godlessness, the spirit of militant secularism and false religiosity now abroad in the world, we understand your suffering as Christians through our suffering as Muslims, and gain greater insight into our own suffering through the contemplation of your suffering. May the most merciful of the merciful regard the sufferings of the righteous and the innocent. May he strengthen us in full submission to his will to follow the spirit and the letter of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world in all our dealings with them. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, praise be to Allah, the cherisher and sustainer of the worlds." The Covenants Initiative is a quintessential example of committed scholarship. In order to gather material for his book, Dr. Morrow traveled the world searching for prophetic covenants in obscure libraries and ancient monasteries. Later on, he issued an appeal to all institutions possessing copies of the prophetic covenants to provide authentic texts and photos of the original documents, in some cases just ahead of ISIS, who were also searching for them, but only to destroy them. We were in a race. And with ISIS, they were looking for these documents too to burn them because they outlawed ISIS in the name of the Prophet, and they obviously did not want these documents to survive. In the course of his quest, he brought many little-known and unknown documents to light, after which he supervised their translation and publication in 14 languages. His work garnered expressions of support from Bartholomew, Ecumenical Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church, from Theophilus III, Patriarch of Jerusalem, from Dr. Muhammad Gamayaha of Al-Azhar University, from a number of Catholic prelates, and from the Ayatollah Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran. A copy of the book was personally presented to His Holiness Pope Francis. Even the highlights of the Covenants Initiative over the past 5 years are too numerous to mention. They include numerous speeches by Dr. Morrow in mosques, at Muslim conventions and interfaith gatherings, innumerable articles and interviews in print, podcast, radio, and television formats, as well as a televised presentation in Abu Dhabi, before the ambassadors of several Muslim nations. In 2016, the Covenants Initiative was contacted by Bishop Francis Kalabat, leader in exile of the Chaldean Catholics of Iraq, now living in the United States. Bishop Kalabat asked us to issue an initiative calling for the actions of ISIS to be declared genocide. This became the Genocide Initiative, which we posted as a petition on change.org, on the change.org website. In March of that year, the Fortenberry Amendment, defining the actions of ISIS as war crimes and genocide, was passed unanimously by the U.S. House of Representatives, followed shortly by a statement to the same effect by Secretary of State John Kerry. Our work was hailed in an article in the premier U.S. Armed Forces publication, Stars and Stripes, as one of the factors that led to the passage of the Fortenberry Amendment. And when ISIS burned St. Mary's Cathedral in the Philippines in 2017, the governor of the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao immediately invoked the covenants of the prophet to prove that this act was un-Islamic. We are confident that this was largely due to our efforts. Two people with a few friends, like Craig Constantine and a few other people who would come in and help us from time to time. And this is not something that two people can do. So we have to assume that someone else was ultimately behind it. But the bottom line is, the Covenants Initiative and its expansion into an international peace movement was entirely based on the work of one committed scholar, Dr. John Andrew Morrow. My contribution was to recognize the value of what Dr. Morrow had achieved, to convince him of its unique importance for this historical moment, and to prevail upon my publisher to publish it. This catapulted me into 5 years of activism in a time in my life when I was certain that this sort of commitment lay several decades in my past. Very well then, but what next? As it turns out, Craig Constantine, Dr. Morrow, Abdul Malik Mujahid, my wife Jenny, and myself will be speaking at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Toronto this coming November. The title of our presentation will be A Presentation of the Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad to the Christians of the World in the 21st Century, with my wife Jenny representing the Christians of the world. She's been through Christianity from one end to the other, and you don't want, if you present it only to the Catholics, then the Orthodox will say, what about us? And so she's a perfect solution to that problem. Returning now to the theme of my talk, which is love of neighbor, I wish to emphasize that such love is not a passive virtue. As the prophetic covenants attest, this love must express itself as active help and defense whenever possible. Such organizations as the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign, a coalition of mostly Christian churches, have come to the defense of Muslims in the U.S. against the rising tide of Islamophobia, which is certainly due in part to Trump's administration policies. But when we offered to reciprocate in obedience to the command of our prophet by doing what we could to defend Christians from their enemies in the U.S., some years ago, it was estimated that around 100 churches per year are burned in the United States, most of them small and rural. And that's something we don't hear about. When I gave that statistic, which is only one group's, small group's estimation, but they've been following it. And I gave that to my Muslim physician friend Faz Khan in New York, and he said, "What?" And he was shocked. He'd never heard that. And many of us have never heard that either. Because, this is an oppression that's going on that is very obscure, because it happens among people who tend to be discounted in this society. Okay, when we said, how can we reciprocate to the shoulder campaign, they could think of no way to respond. Defending the other was part of their moral worldview, but admitting that as Christians they might need some defending themselves was not. And the unfortunate fact is that Christianity and Islam, in common with many other groups, are now largely in competition over who is the most victimized and therefore the most entitled. Dr. Morrow's research, however, indicates that the number of nations in the world persecuting Christians and the number persecuting Muslims are roughly equal. And while such groups as ISIS and Al-Qaeda have certainly killed more Muslims than Christians, including Shia, Sufis, and traditional Sunnis, they have also massacred plenty of Christians, as we know, largely driving them from their ancient homelands in Syria and Iraq. Though, of course, the total number of Muslims killed in the wars that followed on 9/11 dwarfs all other death tolls. Plenty of moving examples exist. Now we get to the actual supposed subject of this talk. Plenty of moving accounts exist of the defense of Christians by Muslims in Iraq and Syria in recent years. In an email to me, Dr. Morrow, who certainly has no love for the Assad regime, writes, the city of Karbala served as a refuge for Christians fleeing from ISIS. They knew they were safe among the Shiites, the followers of the family of the Prophet. Kurdish Sufi Muslims also helped Christians in and around Mosul. Hezbollah has proudly defended Christian holy sites and Christians. There are plenty of stories of the Syrian army coming to the rescue of Christian communities. Take the case of the monastery of St. George al-Humaira in the Valley of the Christians in Syria. They have a covenant of the Prophet. They were surrounded by Takfiri terrorists, hell-bent on destroying the monastery, killing the monks, and destroying the covenant of the Prophet. The Syrian army came, liberated the region, and liquidated the Takfiris. For those who don't know the word Takfiri, it is a corrupt theory among sub-Muslim scholars that any member of a religion or any member of Islam that is not of their sect can legally be killed. That's what the Takfiris are. When the Covenants Initiative made its debut at the Bilal Mosque in Lexington, Kentucky in 2013, I expressed my belief that forces exist in the world today who are actively attempting to turn the religions against each other in order to weaken them. In response, a Muslim from the Indian subcontinent told the story of those nights in his native city when unknown parties would throw pig carcasses into mosques and drag slaughtered cows into Hindu temples, predictably resulting in Muslim-Hindu riots the next day. This and many other indications suggest to me that the meta-strategy of the global elites is to neutralize all the religions. After all, why should an elite cadre of oligarchs backed by global finance who aspire to world domination sit back and do nothing when the beliefs and aspirations and moral standards of billions of people are determined by outmoded religious institutions that those oligarchs do not control? Now, let's see. Did I put this page in here wrong? Just a minute. Okay, here we go. The anti-Muslim sentiments of Donald Trump are no secret. No question. After he has opened his mouth, hate crimes against Muslims have skyrocketed in this country. What is not as clearly admitted or known, however, by many are the actions of the Obama administration to fund and arm ISIS and Al-Qaeda as proxy armies against Syria, Iran, and ultimately Russia. Terrorist groups who have massacred both Muslims and Christians have killed more Muslims than Christians, partly because there's simply more non-terrorist Muslims than Christians in their areas of operation to be killed. Those who can see no relationship between such atrocities abroad and the growing Islamophobia, as well as the cultural soft pogrom against Christianity in the United States, are not, in my opinion, seeing the whole picture. Those Christians who are aware of the rising tide of anti-Christian sentiment in the U.S. are usually conservatives who distrust Muslims, while liberal Christians who are willing to partner with Muslims will often not admit that such anti-Christian sentiment exists, which is why they tend to exercise very little vigilance in situations where self-defense is clearly called for. This is one of the frustrating ironies that the Covenants Initiative has had to contend with. It's very hard for Muslims to obey the Prophet, for the prophetic covenants by defending Christians when Christians see no need to defend themselves. A Muslim leader who wishes to remain anonymous reported to us that at a meeting at the Obama White House in 2016, a delegation of Muslim leaders was told the following by one of the national security advisors, quote, ISIS is now losing territory in Syria and Iraq. Therefore, ISIS fighters will be coming home to the U.S. Home to the U.S.? Home to the U.S. Muslim leaders, we want your help in reintegrating these fighters into U.S. society. How charitable of the president. Reintegrate these fighters into U.S. society for which federal grant funds are available. On hearing this, the Muslim leader in question said to himself, does this woman realize that ISIS has a hit list of U.S. Muslim leaders, some of whom are in this room? It is clear from this and many other indications that the U.S. government has been running mercenaries under the banner of ISIS and al-Nusra and the Free Syrian Army in Syria and Iraq, just as it trained and armed Salvadoran death squads in the 1980s. Since, as far as we know, no actual record of that White House meeting exists, we began scouring the web for evidence of a government plan to reintegrate ISIS fighters into the U.S. Our findings appear in Dr. Morrow's article, Welcome Home ISIS, the Obama administration's plan to reintegrate foreign terrorist fighters. At the same time as the Obama administration was sponsoring the growth of ISIS, a historical fact attested to by a Defense Intelligence Agency memo obtained by Judicial Watch through the Freedom of Information Act, addressed by Seamus Milne in his June 2015 article in The Guardian, and finally admitted to in an interview by Ben Rhodes, Deputy Security Advisor under Obama. At the same time as this was happening, our little Christian-Muslim dialogue in Lexington, Kentucky was hosting speakers from Homeland Security, the FBI, the Federal Attorney's Office, and the State Department. In other words, the very same people who were funding and arming ISIS to kill Christians and Muslims in Syria were sponsoring interfaith amity between Christians and Muslims in the United States. This, in my estimation, represents a two-pronged attack against religion, ultimately all religion, since for Christians and Muslims to meet and profess friendship under the auspices of their common enemies represents a serious undermining of their independence. And this pincers movement against religion, this strategy of terrorism alternating with co-optation, is certainly not limited to the United States of America. The origin, the true form and purpose, the detailed history, and the names of the actual sponsors of this assault all need to be exhaustively researched. In answer to the question, what can I do, that many of you may now be asking, I have two suggestions. First, I invite all interested Muslims to sign the Covenants Initiative, which is available on our website. On this first table here, I've got two piles of pages. One has the URLs of a lot of the allegations I'm making in this talk, so you can research them for yourself. And the other one is actually a poem I put together from some of the quatrains of Rumi, which I wanted to make singable in English, so it came out in iambic pentameter. So in answer to the question, what can I do, et cetera, sign the Covenants Initiative. Secondly, for years I have imagined a network of Christians and Muslims pledged to defend each other whenever either group is attacked. The Covenants Initiative does not have the resources to organize such a network on our own, yet elements of it, the shoulder-to-shoulder campaign, for example, already exist. The first step toward creating or expanding such an alliance would be to convene a conference to discuss this possibility, out of which would come a number of ongoing working groups tasked with thoroughly researching the global attack on religion and developing strategies to counter it. Let Muslims and Christians never forget, however, that the first step in any such effort should be prayer, specifically prayer to God for his strength and guidance. If the mention of God and prayer in this context seems jarring or out of place, this simply indicates the low ebb to which true religion has fallen in our world. God is the end, therefore we must never forget to place him at the beginning. And since my own spiritual path is Sufism, I will end this talk with a poem I arranged from the quatrains of Jalaluddin Rumi, the most famous master of our way, specifically to remind us that, as the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, said, "This world is nothing more than a lone tree in the desert under which the weary traveler can rest for a while before the caravan passes on." Here is the poem. "O friend, our friendship makes a mighty union. Where you might walk, I'll be the earth for you. In the creed of lovers, it's a dark transgression through your eyes to see this world, but not see you. I'm glad this world can never make me happy. I'm glad to be drunk, though not by drinking wine. Why would I need to hear some other story when endless blessings rise from my secret glory? May the heart of love never look upon this world. What's worthy to be seen by love but love? The day I die, I'll cast away these eyes if, gazing on this world, they turned from love. How long to see and smell this passing scene? It's time to meet that one of perfect grace. In the mirror of his face, I'll see my form. In the mirror of my heart, I'll find his face. The fruit will set on the blossoming branch someday. The hungry falcon will seize the dove someday. His image ebbs and flows. When will it stay? It will come to live inside your heart someday. So, thank you.
Thank you both so much for those talks. And I thought we'd begin by flipping your topics a bit. So I'd like to start with Dr. Constantine. You've written what I consider one of the best introductory works on the covenants, Religious Pluralism and Civic Rights in a Muslim Nation, an analysis of Prophet Muhammad's covenants with Christians. Can you discuss why you find this text meaningful?
Thank you. I think it's meaningful because the covenants are a bridge between perceived worlds. I think we live in a time of binaries where we see these terms being floated around like Islamic civilization, Western civilization, the United States versus the world, et cetera, et cetera. And the covenants are actually a way of imagining the United States and imagining American national identity as being synonymous and compatible with Islamic values. So when we think about something like a civic nation, in this country, we imagine this as a nation that is not, your sense of belonging is not predicated on your race or your religion, et cetera, et cetera. What makes you an American are your inalienable rights, which are protected through the law, through a constitution. That's what it means to be a civic nation versus an ethnic nation or a racial nation in which your sense of belonging is determined by your birth. So the covenants are suggesting, actually no, they're proclaiming that Christians are part of the Ummah. They're part of an Islamic state or an Islamic nation, that you don't have to necessarily follow a particular creed to be protected by the state. And in terms of religious pluralism, Diana Eck at Harvard University is one of the top scholars on this concept of religious pluralism, and she calls it the energetic engagement of diversity. It's not simply tolerance. What she's saying is tolerance is not enough in our current era. You know, when you think of the term tolerance, it's quite standoffish. For parents in here, you might tolerate a child, which is not bad, but it's also like, you tolerate, etc. This country has had its ups and downs in terms of incorporating religious diversity. America is kind of like this never-ending, ongoing project. But in terms of energetically engaging with diversity, I think a lot of what Charles was saying, with the shoulder-to-shoulder campaign, you're energetically engaging not simply with ideas but with people, and you're committing yourselves to protecting certain communities, and that is clearly what the covenants also do. So the covenants they're a bridge. They're a bridge between perceived worlds, and I thought it was valuable to contribute that piece of scholarship.
Thank you. And now asking you to address Dr. Constantine's topic, Charles, can you speak on how the love of God, of Jesus, of Christianity, and even your wife Jenny, who's a Christian, as you mentioned, inspires your work with the Covenants Initiative?
Well, it could not have been done unless in the context of love. Those who are not in that context would look at the covenants and see nothing much there, not relevant, not interesting. Whereas if you realize it's very touching the way Muhammad, his cordiality in these documents toward the Christians. It's more, I should actually tell a story that Dr. Morrow brought forth in his book, The Covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the World. The story is that, this is told by the Bedouins of the Sinai and by the Christians. And so you might call it apocryphal, but there's a lot of reason to believe it actually took place. We know that Muhammad was a caravan leader, and according to this story, one of the places he supplied on his caravans was St. Catherine's Monastery near Mount Sinai. And there was a day when he came in with his caravan, and he was resting after the trek. I see him, he was leaning against a wall or against a tree, I don't know which, and one of the monks saw above him an eagle was hovering. And the monk said, "This has got to be a sign." So the monks came to him and said, "Could you write us a document where you will place us under your protection?" And he says, "Well, who am I? I'm just a caravan leader. I can't protect anybody." And I said, "Well, no, I think this is a good thing, if you will do this." And he said, "All right." So since he could not write, he put his handprint in ink and put it on this document that I guess the monks had, told him what they were going to say. And later on, when Islam expanded politically and militarily into that area, the covenant was renewed and expanded, and that's the version that I quoted. So this is love. Muhammad, it was Christians who first recognized that he was going to be a prophet. There was a monk of Syria. There was Hanif, which is a sect of monotheists waiting for the next prophet in Arabia. And then there was the monk of St. Catherine's Monastery. And they all said, you have a great destiny. You will be a prophet. And it was the Christian leader of Abyssinia at the time, the Negus, who gave oppressed Muslims sanctuary across the Red Sea in Ethiopia when they were under oppression in Mecca. So this is all love, and you can feel the radiance of Muhammad's love for his brother prophet and for a brother revelation, because the Quran says, this is not a new revelation. That this is a confirmation of what's gone before, including Torah and gospel. And Muhammad made that real by offering his protection to Christians. You can tell. Dr. Morrow wonders if the light verse wasn't suggested partly by what's called the lampada, which is the hanging lamp that you'll find in Orthodox churches with a candle in it. Who knows? But obviously there was a great love because the prophet loved those who loved God. And when he saw the love of God, he was moved. And so the love of God becomes the basis of human brotherhood and love between human beings. There's no other basis. Everything outside of that is some kind of self-interest.
Thank you. Before I open it up to the audience for questions, I'd like to ask you both one more question and see if we can't, maybe offend everyone else in the room that we haven't already. Seriously, it seems that there's a relationship between wars in the Middle East fought by the U.S. Under the Bush and Obama administrations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and the xenophobia that we now see under the Trump administration with migration to not only the U.S. but also Europe. Can you speak to how there's a symbiotic relationship between these wars abroad and fear at home?
Well, I'd say this. Oftentimes what I say, Islamophobia and the ISIS narrative of Islam are two sides of the same coin. Oftentimes what you see are people that are sympathetic to anti-Muslim views, or people that happen to be Muslim who are sympathetic to anti-Christian views, have the same understanding of faith, of religion. They oftentimes use the same Quranic passages to justify their actions. So I think the government in this country, in DC, the national government, really needs to come to terms with its hypocritical decisions, because we're really just adding fuel to the fire. So I don't know, Charles, what you might be more passionate about this one than me.
I agree entirely. I've made that point myself, that the reading of the Quran of the Islamophobes and of ISIS and their ilk is pretty close, But, well, Trump and Obama, two sides of the same problem. Obama, in sort of the what has become the unfortunate tradition of this country is, we'll keep the problems in other nations, we'll fight our wars, proxy wars, or whatever, elsewhere, and we will try to keep the people at home happy, and we'll preach, tolerance domestically while we kill millions internationally. So what happened is Trump just reversed that, His treatment of Muslims in this country is, the plight of Muslims is much worse in this country after Trump. But on the other hand, Trump really has been serious in going against ISIS. Where he is now, it's hard to tell. Whether he's been captured by the same forces that were really behind Obama's policies, it's hard to tell. He's a very erratic, ambiguous, and scary kind of person, and you don't know what he's going to do next. But there was that moment when, he was feeling very good about Russia, and he wanted to have rapprochement with Russia, and there was that moment. You see, what happened with Russia was, we're saying, well, they're going on another expansion, that's dangerous, and we always remember what Hitler did, and now maybe Russia's going to do the same thing, and they've occupied the Crimea. Well, Russia could be a very dangerous force in the world, but when they occupied the Crimea, what was happening is we were afraid they were going to intervene in Syria and get in the way of our running of ISIS, in our support of ISIS against the Assad regime, and we didn't want Russia to come in, so we were pressuring them to the point where we were close to denying them their Black Sea ports. So Russia occupied the Crimea, saying, you're not going to deny us these ports. And what happened next is that the Russian Navy sailed and came to Syria and stood behind the Assad regime, which is a very evil regime. I mean, I'm afraid politics is not black and white. Assad is bad news. He's a true dictator, a true despot. Yet, under him, the Christians have had a degree of protection, which under ISIS and Al-Qaeda, nothing. So Russia, there was that moment when Trump came in and nobody knew what was going to happen, and there was, the policies were not solid. And this is when Putin said, now we can go into Syria. And I don't know if he could have done it now, but he did it then. And because of that, ISIS has been defeated largely. They're going after the last strongholds of ISIS in Iraq now, where the whole movement began. And that wouldn't have happened under Obama because Obama helped create ISIS. And I do not believe it would have happened under Hillary Clinton. But it did happen perhaps almost by accident under Trump. So we have two sides of the evil of hatred of Islam. Obama, doing terrible attacks. And because really, ISIS is an attack against Islam. Certainly they've massacred a lot of Christians and Yazidis and whoever else they could get their hands on. But what they are is a fifth column, partly of mercenaries paid by the United States. Those are the ones who get to come home. ISIS come home. These are the paid professional top mercenaries that the U.S. has been sponsoring. The cannon fodder who has to stay as Russia or the United States or whoever finally bombs them into oblivion are the foolish believers who think that, young fools who come from around the world thinking that they were defending Islam by joining ISIS. They're expendable, but the important people are these mercenaries who are not necessarily Muslims at all. They have a wardrobe of many different ethnic costumes that over the years they will, well, let's see, what race or religion are we supposed to be this year in this war? Oh, we can do that. We've got our routine, all worked out. These people, and these are the people that the Obama administration was welcoming home under the smokescreen of saying, well, we simply want to help the young, foolish Muslims who didn't know what they were getting into when they joined ISIS, and they saw how terrible it was, and now they want out, and we have to help them. That was the smokescreen. Maybe some of that was going on, but the purpose of that program was to run what has come to be called a rat line of mercenaries coming back from Syria and Iraq, into protective cushy protective custody in the United States until they could be used for some future war. So, Obama, Trump, 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
I mean, one of the challenges, I think, which Craig brings up in, the other side, which you're referring to, Charles, is that, life in the U.S. for American Muslims is much harder now under the Trump administration. And partially because of the points that you're bringing up. But I'd like to thank you both and open it up to the audience to ask anyone here if you have questions for our speakers.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace to everybody. So I take it, Dr. Upton, from your analysis of the situation in Syria, you don't very much buy the notion of the moderate rebels, that make much of a distinction between the moderate rebels.
Well, that's correct. I mean, certain distinctions can be made, but there are both mercenaries and takfiris among the Free Syrian Army. And of course, we've not just been supporting them, we've been supporting al-Nusra, which is simply an element of al-Qaeda, that changed its name and started to take arms and funds from us and strategic direction. So, yeah, I think the idea of the moderate rebel is a myth.
Yes, I believe that the only way to stop fear and to love God is to get rid of the blasphemous doctrine that God would eternally damn some people to hell. The Jewish and Christian scriptures say that every knee will bend and every tongue will praise God. So I believe that in the end, God will purify and will heal all of us of our wickedness and will save and will bring to paradise or heaven every single human being. And unless this is believed, if people believe that the God they worship will torture his enemies for all eternity, then what could be wrong if I kill my enemies, if God does this to his enemies? So we have to believe that God loves all of us and will, in the end, save all of us. Thank you.
Amen.
Inshallah.
Amen. I agree 100%. I think
the question is, how do we achieve that reality in people's minds? You know, I think hatred and bigotry and the spread of propaganda is big business for some people. Like, this has been well documented in the Islamophobia industry. The spread of anti-Muslim information and knowledge is lucrative. It's a lucrative business. And I'm sure the same can be said on the other side of the spectrum in this country with Christian theologians and these televangelists and so on and so forth. So it's going to take a real concerted effort by people of conscience to start implementing these ideas at a practical level in people's minds and in their hearts. Because there's always going to be people who are going to disagree, and they have power and they have influence. So I agree. I think collectively it'd be interesting to see how all of us could put our heads together and figure out how do we actually eradicate that totalitarian idea that you're talking about.
I'd like to add. Charles is, as I mentioned, one of the leading scholars in the traditionalist school, which, one of its hallmarks is the idea that, to quote Ananda Kumaraswamy, all paths lead to the same summit, which you also find in the Quran. But I'd like to also ask you, Charles, to discuss this point.
I would be glad to discuss that, but first I would really like to address this gentleman's question or statement on a more theological level. From the standpoint, at this point, of the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox teach that God is love and God only loves. God does not condemn anyone. And yet, there are people who hate love and cannot stand it. And the more love you show them, the more they suffer, and the more they scream and protest and say, no, you're taking away my reality. You're ruining, my identity. You're violating my boundaries. I don't want this love. And there's plenty of people like that. Those are the people who have sent themselves to hell because they cannot stand the love of God. They run, and God lets them go because they've got free will. But, well, what does one say? In terms of the doctrines of the traditionalist school, or also called the perennialists, I don't like to necessarily talk about that school as if it had its own doctrines. It does, more or less, in some ways, but it's just this. It's a great introduction to the great religions of the world. And I began that introduction basically in the counterculture in the San Francisco Bay Area, when people were running around to every religion they could find. It was very promiscuous. It wasn't entirely serious, but there was a great true seeking behind it. People would be a Buddhist, or no, I don't want to do this, now I'll be a Hindu, and this, or you'll become a Jesus freak, But so I essentially grew up in a context where all these religions were looked at as alternatives or as possibly all valid. But when it comes to the traditionalist writers, René Guénon, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Fritjof Schuon, Martin Lings, Titus Burckhardt, and actually many others, they've raised this understanding of that God has sent more than one revelation to humanity. They've raised that to probably the highest level of expression that we've ever had, which, as Zachary says, is also the position of certain verses of the Quran. But, I think the bottom line is, though, if you recognize sanctity, if you know what a saint is, then you will see, well, whether I agree with the theology of this or that, or understand the theology of this or that religion, these people are saints. Ramakrishna and Ramana Maharshi in Hinduism, they're real saints. St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco, who died in the 60s, and his relics are in a cathedral in Geary Street, San Francisco, a real saint. And among the Sufis, the great saints, Bayezid Bistami, and just the longest list, of truly God-realized holy people. If you recognize holiness, and the Buddhists, certainly plenty of saints there. So if you know what saints are, you could say, well, maybe I can't figure out how they became saints through this strange theology that I don't understand, but I gotta admit it. Because if I know that God is love, then I will know who he loves. And I will see he loves these people because they are his saints. And that's the bottom line for me when it comes to the validity of more than one religion. So.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I wanted to, you just kind of opened my eyes right now when you spoke about the flip side of the coin. It's the same thing. I just remembered about Mujahideen and now the Taliban. So maybe you can shed a little bit more light on that. Another thing I wanted to ask you about the Sharia. The Sharia law, there's a lot of fear among people. I keep hearing it because I'm also part of the interfaith. That there is but isn't that a code of living for a Muslim, and it has nothing to do with the non-Muslim?
Of course.
And then we are hearing this, like just yesterday, Trump talked about the immigration in England. The culture has been changing. What is that fear of migrants and immigration and other people kind of intermixing with the Americans and other white nations or the Western nations?
Which one should we
Well,
take first? We'll tackle them all.
When it comes to immigration, you know, the white race is afraid because the birth rate of the white race is down. And, you know, the people from other nations are getting drawn into a demographic vacuum. And that is terrifying to white people, but where did they lose the heart for life that they did not want to have children? How did that happen? That's the other side of it. You know, I'm not going to blame, you know, the white race for having too few children or blame the immigrants for coming into that vacuum. It's just that's the way, you know, that's the dynamic, you know. And certainly, so many immigrants are simply running from their lives and for their lives, and they're running from wars that the Western nations, particularly the United States, have you know, imposed upon them. You know, and you know, but it's also necessary to understand that. I mean. No nation can simply have absolutely open borders, or will cease to be a nation. We have to have a rational immigration policy, which we have not had. One of the purposes for illegal immigrants, mostly from Latin America in this country, is, well, it's great for union busting. You have a lot of people come in here who can never unionize because they're illegal, who can be deported at any time, who have effectively no civil rights. And they can, you know, they can be controlled, and then they can weaken the labor movement. The people who were opposed to immigration, illegal immigration, not opposed to rational immigration or compassionate openness to people who have real needs in other nations, but just porous borders. The people who are opposed to this included Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers Movement, who's you know, one of the great leftist heroes of California, and also Russell Means of the American Indian movement, because, you know, they see how, from their point of view, illegal immigrants are, you know, hurting their livelihoods. We're not just talking about, you know, we always say, well, white people don't like other nations because they have this idea that immigrants are taking away jobs. In a lot of cases, that is foolishness, not in all cases. But certainly if you know, one of the major Latino leaders, or the major Latino leader of the United States, was opposed to illegal immigration and also a major leader of the American Indian movement, then, you know, we need to look again about immigration. There are two sides to that. And I'm afraid Donald Trump has no nuance in his mind about, you know, he's not going to look at two sides of anything. It's so much simpler just to stir up racism and racial hatred, and you know, you get a certain percentage of the population behind you automatically. And so I think Trump is trying to fix a real problem, but he's making it immensely worse because you know, he has no compassion. So.
Yeah, in terms of this fear of the migrant and this idea that migrants or refugees or immigrants are going to be, migrating to U.S. soil and changing the culture. That argument is a white nationalist argument. I'm sure you know. If you go to Breitbart, you see it there. But I think if we look at some significant scholarship that has been developed in recent years, there's a really good book by a scholar from, I believe it's Colombia, Mamdani, and he wrote a book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Essentially what he's saying, if I could wrap it up in a nutshell, it's the conflation of Muslims over there, somewhere in the world, with Muslims here on U.S. soil. That conflation should never happen. It shouldn't happen for any community, but Muslims seem to have to deal with that depiction more so than Christians. Like when a Christian identity movement in Nigeria goes and kills Muslims, no one is asking me, a Christian or other Christians, to speak on behalf of that issue.
Right.
So people need to recognize the uniqueness of the U.S. Muslim population and experience. The entire Ummah is represented in the United States. So we have to collectively as a nation get out of this monolithic mentality. Everything has to be, at least it's perceived to be a monolith. So Muslims are a monolith. Therefore, Sharia is also a monolith. Even though Sharia is implemented differently in different Muslim majority countries around the world, it's implemented in different Muslim populations and Muslim communities in this country. And I write about this in my book. Like, there's a really interesting quote that was given by an imam, and he said most imams actually don't even really talk specifically about Sharia in mosques because it's so complicated. And most people just can't follow the intricacies and the details of how rigorous that understanding and that education is. Just to end on a fact, and polls have shown this, Sharia, as you mentioned, it's a way of life. So when you have state legislatures around this country actually putting into law banning foreign law, which we all know is Sharia, I mean, that is completely unconstitutional, 100% unconstitutional. But interestingly, most U.S. Muslims overwhelmingly prefer to be governed at the national level, not by any Saudi Arabian idea of Sharia. They prefer the Constitution. That's what they prefer. And Sharia is something understood by a huge chunk of the U.S. Muslim population, according to the data, as something that is practiced and understood at a private level. And sometimes it involves marriage contracts and stuff like this. So people just don't even know what Sharia, I'm talking non-Muslims, they have no idea what it even means.
Well, I think we'll have to wrap it up there, but I want to thank both Dr. Constantine and Charles Upton for joining us, for your love expressed, I think, through courage tonight and a willingness to speak up for the neighbor. And please give them a round of applause.